On this day, October the 2nd, 1936, a little red-headed kid was walking home from school, went by a Chinese laundry, and I'll tell you the rest of the story, but let's get back to the game. Well, we'll talk about the red-headed kid in a minute, but right now, another red-headed kid is getting into the box. Justin Turner, followed by Seager and Puig, so you can see how the game is so constructed for you. I'm telling about a little redhead, and here's Turner. Remarkable production. And the first pitch to Justin, way inside, ball one. Yeah, the little kid, not quite 9, 8 3/4, leaving grammar school on his way home. And I went by a Chinese laundry. That's way outside. 2 balls and no strikes. And the line score of a baseball game was pasted on the window. And it showed game 2 of the World Series with the Yankees beating the Giants 18-4 as Turner fouls the ball back. There it was, game 2. Imagine a reserve seat cost $5. Well, anyway, as that little redheaded kid looked and saw, oh wow, the poor Giants. That was my reaction. And so I became not only a Giants fan, but a big fan of baseball. And I was able to exercise my instinct. The pitch to Turner is away, 2-1, because my school was less than 20 blocks to the old Polo Grounds where the New York Giants played. And because I was a member of the Police Athletic League Catholic Youth Organization, I could game free from Monday to Friday. We got out of school at 2:30. The Giant games were 3:15. And so I could go to the ball game. And so I just fell in love with baseball. Most of the time I was in center field. Now, center field in the Polo Grounds was 483 feet away as Turner strikes out, 1 down. So I would sit in the bleachers and I would cheer and I would watch, and I just loved the Giants. Well, the point of the whole story is this. My first love was October the 2nd, 1936. Second game of the World Series. Today is October the 2nd, 2016. A lot of time has gone by. Exactly 80 years to the minute from that day that I looked at the line score of the World Series. So when I looked at the schedule and I knew I was going to retire, I thought, I have to do that game. It was as if it was ordained that I would do this game. We are all grieving over the loss of the young pitcher of the Miami Marlins, Jose Fernandez. A 3 a.m. wreck, not of a car, but of a boat. And when I first heard 3 a.m., maybe you're thinking the same way. I thought, well, what in the world's going on at 3 o'clock in the morning? Well, it turns out he and his 2 closest buddies were going fishing. It took about at least another hour once they got in the water with the boat. Puig, big swing and a miss. So they were going fishing and crashed into that big rocky outlet like a little peninsula. There he is. A remarkably talented 24 years old. Here's the strike 1 pitch on the way. Anderson delivers fastball, high fly ball. That'll get 1 home. Also at second base, Turner tagged, but he's going to hold. And coming in to score on the RBI by Puig, that makes it 2-1. Colorado, and Kendrick brings it back to the dugout. So Puig takes an opportunity to get the ribby. And now the batter is Adrian Gonzalez. So Puig getting 5s in the dugout as he picks up the ribby. Yasiel's 44th RBI. Here's Gonzalez, runner at second, 2 out, 2-1 Rockies. Anderson a high set and delivers. That sprayed foul down the left field line, out of play. Talking about the late Jose Fernandez, it's rather an ironic note. He sent a tweet, believe it or not, back in 2015, September the 1st. He probably, I'm only guessing, probably had read this somewhere. Throw back to second, close with no cigar. Anyway, young Jose a year ago wrote the following: if you were given a book with the story of your life, would you read the end? He was 23 then and already thinking some pretty deep thoughts.
Well, if there's one satisfaction to a Dodger fan tonight, amidst all of the frustration, is they will get a chance to see Mariano Rivera. Mariano, 6'2", 190. He's had 19 years in the big leagues. He has 641 saves. He's been a closer since 1997. He certainly helped the Yankees win 4 World Series in 5 years. This year, Rivera, even at his tender age, has a brilliant earned run average of 1.64. He also has 33 saves. The cutter, which is a fastball that breaks, they say that his cutter breaks about 8 inches. It's a remarkable pitch. Basically, it's the only pitch he throws now, and even though they know it's coming, they can't handle it. If you look at his important numbers, besides the wins and the loss, he has walked 7 and he has struck out 36. He is allowed to hit an inning, and Hanley Ramirez to start. Strike. 0-1. Right-hand batters in their career against Rivera, they're hitting .215. Left-hand batters in the career hitting .209. 0-2 to Hanley. In the last 15 years, Mariano Rivera has blown back-to-back saves 10 times in 15 years. And he's even tougher in the postseason. Ball 1. In the postseason, Mariano Rivera has converted 42 of 47 opportunities, and his earned run average in the postseason is 0.7. Fouled away. The New York Times did a study years ago, and they said in 2001, Mariano Rivera broke 44 bats. So with that in mind, when he made his farewell appearance in Minnesota, they presented him with a rocking chair made up of broken bats. Hit foul, out of play. Before the game, Mariano, very much a worthwhile human being beside a baseball player, received a marvelous deep sea fishing rod. His dad was a sardine fisherman in Panama. He'd go out with him and spend all day out on the sea in the broiling sun, and some days catch nothing. And now he would love to fish in his retirement. And down goes Hanley, chasing a bad ball. So he really helped out. And down goes Ramirez. Mark Ellis, no doubt, still smarting over the error. Dodgers had some dramatic walk-offs. They've had 2 straight. In fact, the Dodger record 3 straight back in 2010. Mark Ellis last night got the base hit. The game before, in the 11th inning, Puig hit the home run. Now here's Ethier. That's the cutter. 0-1. Ethier kind of looks over to the dugout as if say, oh, now I know. They have a relatively new stat They combine walks and hits and innings pitched. They call it WHIP. W-H-I-P. The most phenomenal modern day WHIP belongs to Mariano Rivera. It's 1. You have to go back to pitchers Addie Joss and Ed Walsh, and they pitched in the early 1900s, the dead ball. So WHIP is more like flog when it comes to Rivera and the opposition. 0-2. Got it. Ethier looks at Sabathia, looks over at CB. So Rivera comes in and doesn't disappoint unless you're a hitter. Mark Ellis had the base hit last night, and of course last night he was a hero. Tonight, of course, they was already 1-0 in favor of the Yankees in the pop fly when Puig and Ellis had problem with it, and the Yankees got 2 extra runs. So here is A.J. Ellis, and ball 1. Mariano Rivera is such a worthwhile human being. He's made a lot of money in baseball, but he has given it back. That's just right. He built a church in his small town in Panama. He built a church in New Rochelle, New York. His wife Clara is going to be the pastor. He also spent $3 million to buy an old church in New York. He's going to refurnish and bring that to life. And he takes the life right out of the Dodgers, getting 2 strikeouts and a routine ground ball.
Bottom of the first inning, no score. By the way, when we start the top of the second inning, because Old Glory means so much to each and every one of us, and this is a great and patriotic weekend. Starting the top of the second inning, and we're certainly not going to get into the game with it. We're going to drop in a few notes about the Star Spangled Banner and the flag itself and the author. So if there are youngsters around, you might want to bring them a little closer at the start of an inning, and they'll learn a little something extra about our flag. By 1977, the United States was waffling on the exact look of its flag. It was a cause for concern for Thomas Green, an American Indian who wanted the protection of an official flag while traveling through treacherous territory. He asked Congress to help, throwing in 3 strings of wampum to sweeten the deal. Within 10 days, a resolution was passed, finalizing the flag as a creation with 13 stars and 13 stripes. The date, June the 14th, 1777. 1-0 Dodgers, top of the third inning. You know, she may have seen and sewn quite a few in her day. There's no actual evidence that Betsy Ross was the person responsible for the design of our flag. In fact, Betsy's name didn't even come up in conjunction with the deed until 1876, 40 years after her death. The first person to have made the claim was a New Jersey congressman. The deal was not accepted, and by the way, there also seems to be a dispute as to whether Betsy Ross ever lived in Philadelphia's popular Betsy Ross home. Curtis Granderson takes a strike, and the count 0-1. Top of the fourth inning, 1-0 Dodgers. The flag has 13 stripes, except when it didn't. Upon welcoming Vermont and Kentucky, they would be states 14 and 15 into the Union. A new version of the flag was created that had 15 stars and 15 stripes. Well, as the U.S. continued to add new states, there was concern about having to continually add additional stripes. So the solution, well, stick with the 13 to represent the original colonies and let the stars do the heavy lifting. Top of the fifth, the 1-1 tie. We talked about the fact they decided that the stripes would remain and the changes would occur with the stars. Well, as of 1818, convention settled in that way. However, one thing remained, let's say, uncodified: the star layout. Well, there was a 26-star flag. There was a 33-star Fort Sumter flag.
There was even a 38-star concentric creation as well. So the stars have changed, but the stars and the stripes remain the same. And we go to the fifth, 1-1 on a magnificent sunset time in Southern California. 1-1, top of the sixth inning. You know, the flag that Francis Scott Key wrote, "Hailed at the twilight's last gleaming," it didn't fly through the perilous fight. It was pouring rain the night that the British were really trying to tear up Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And the smaller of the two large flags that the soldiers had, because of the rain, the big flag could not be put up in the wet. So they put the small flag up, and then when the United States held and the British was stopped, they took the small wet flag down, they put the large flag up, and that's the flag that Francis Scott Key saw while he was negotiating with the British on a British warship. Top of the seventh, a 1-1 tie. You know, there have been 27 official versions of the U.S. flag, each with a different amount of stars. A 39-star version is not among them, and that didn't stop a lot of people, some enterprising flag manufacturers, from producing one for the marketplace. The reason for the miscalculation? Some thought North Dakota and South Dakota were going to be admitted as one state. You know, 1-1 tie, top of the eighth inning. When Alaska and Hawaii became states number 49 and 50, President Eisenhower received thousands of ideas for an updated flag. Almost all of them were of a 50-star flag, including the one that won. The one that won was from Robert G. Heft, who created the design for a class project. He was one of three to submit the version that was accepted and remains in use today. By the way, for the student, his name was Robert Heft, 17 years old, from Lancaster, Ohio, and he got a B- on his project. 1-1, top of the ninth inning. By the way, the 50-star flag is their first one to have lasted 50 years. In contrast, over a 50-year period in the early 1800s, the flag went through 17 different versions. And by the way, the actual flag, the one that they put up after the rain in Baltimore that inspired the Star-Spangled Banner, it still exists. It does indeed. It's immortalized in the Star-Spangled Banner, 15-star, 15-bar flag. What's left of it is on permanent display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of America. The 13th. Pretty hard to figure out, and in doing a little research about why and how Friday the 13th became such a superstition, you have to go back maybe to an 1869 biography of a musician where they referred to it as a bad day. The pitched AJ is low. In numerology, the number 12 is considered completeness. You know, 12 months of the year, 12 hours on the clock, 12 gods of Olympus, 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles of Jesus, the 12 successors of Muhammad in Shia Islam, 12 signs of the zodiac for that matter as well. The 2-2 pitch on the way is inside, ball 3. The number 13, however, is considered irregular. You might not know it, I never did. In Spanish-speaking countries, instead of Friday, Tuesday the 13th is considered a day of bad luck. Tuesday the 13th. Never knew that. Throw to first, not in time. Van Slyke diving back. And they tell me the Greeks also considered Tuesday, especially the 13th, as an unlucky day. They said it was dominated by the influence of Ares, the god of war. 3-2 the count. Runner goes. Pitch is high for ball 4. So there'll be 2 on with 1 out. As A.J. Ellis trots to first, Van Slyke advances to second, and Mark Ellis will be coming up. You know, another interesting note about it, while we're waiting for a little action, In Italian popular culture, Friday the 17th is a bad day. In Italy, 13 is generally considered a lucky number. So take your pick. They also did a survey out of North Carolina, and they said anywhere from 17 to 21 million people in the United States are frightened to death about Friday the 13th. All right, here's Mark Ellis. Fortunately, wears 14. And Mark swings, fouls it back, and the count 0-1. Of course, we were talking before about religion and the Jewish faith. Friday, not necessarily the 13th, but the day Christ was crucified and will forever remembered on Good Friday. 0-1 the count to Mark Ellis. He takes in the dirt. I'm not trying to get smart, just looked it up, figuring a lot of you folks might find it a little interesting. Like you, I'd be lost without Google. I'm not trying to show off, but I just found it a little interesting. And one last thought, some of the famous people who died on Friday the 13th, like here in Hollywood, Richard Zanuck, the wonderful chef, Julia Child. 1-1 pitch, ground ball up along third, foul ball, no play. So Mark will have to come back and try it again. Tupac Shakur died. Benny Goodman died on Friday the 13th. Hubert Humphrey, the senator from Minnesota. The writer Mickey Spillane. The singer Lily Pons. Diamond Jim Brady, you might have heard of that name. Okay, I quit. I promise no more. Yeah, there goes, if you're watching on TV, there goes number 13. Hanley Ramirez. I'm not going to do it now because there's 2 out and the base is empty, but sometime during the game, if you've been like the way I have been, looking at players with these big beards, I decided I'm going to do a little research on beards. So during the game, yeah, there's plenty of them around. We'll tell you a couple of stories as we go through it. 2 down, second inning, no score. And first pitch, fastball for a strike. First of all, they say way back to the dawn of humanity, beards evolved, number one, because ladies like them. And number two, it was the idea of frightening off adversaries and wild animals. There's the 1-strike pitch, swung on and missed strike 2. In fact, it was so serious, if you look it up, there's a divine mandate for beards in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. No balls and 2 strikes, they count. Stripling from the first base side of the rubber. Strike 2 pitch to Norris is promptly hit into right field, and it lands in front of Kike for a base hit. So Norris, a 2-out single to right, and that will bring up Jamal Weeks.
Number 8, Jamal Weeks.
There became a time where Greek dramatists mined the popular prejudice against clean-shaven men. Back then, clean-shaven men were looked as the, maybe effeminate. And then along came Alexander the Great. That's another story. Alexander the Great was not only great, but he also thought he was the greatest looking man in the world. Oh, absolutely. Stripling ready, delivers, gets a strike. And Alexander the Great said, there is no reason to cover up my beautiful face with a beard. And so all of a sudden, it started to disappear. I love the idea that he felt he was so beautiful. One strike. Stripling ready, looks over at Norris, back to the hitter, and that's lined into left field for a base hit. Norris goes to second. So back-to-back base hits with 2 out, and the batter will be Adam Rosales. After Alexander the Great wanted clean-shaven people, it got so that the University of Paris banned long-bearded men from the lecture halls. That's back in 1533. And a few years later, the city's chief court outlawed beards on judges and advocates. And then you got to be the Russian strongmen
who liked a shaved face but long wigs. The first pitch in for a strike. Did you know that the first woman female king of Egypt wore a fake beard to convince people that she was a man? Yeah, her name was Hatshepsut. Here's the strike one pitch on the way. Stripling's pitch in the dirt. Throw down to Utley. Not in time. 1 ball and 1 strike to count. Then, of course, you come to Abraham Lincoln, who was clean shaven. And a little 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell, she said to Mr. Lincoln, "If you would grow a beard, my daddy has a beard and my mother will tease him to vote for you." So Abraham Lincoln grew a beard. And of course that came up when his chief rival said to him, "You're two-faced." And Abraham Lincoln said, "If I were two-faced, would I have the face that I'm wearing now?" So he answered him pretty well. 2-1 to count. Stripling in a little trouble here. The 2-1 pitch on the way is taken for a strike. 2-2. In 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that Americans do not have a legal right to grow beards or mustaches as they choose if their employer demands a clean face. Ah, yes, the beards. Here's the 2-2 pitch on the way. Stripling set over the top. Pitch is low, ball 3.
Tell you a story about Walter Austin. Story that certainly has lived down through the years. That's off the plate. Dodgers had played a Sunday afternoon game in Pittsburgh, and they lost the game. And then when they got on the bus for the long drive to the airport, it was a city bus, you know, hardback and a hard seat. And the Dodger bus was going along in the freeway. It's a big, long uphill drive in Pittsburgh to get to the airport. And the Pirate bus came by, and it was one of those buses richly outfitted and flying by the Dodger bus. And the pilot of the Pirate bus, maybe egged on by the team, he honked the horn, beep, 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 and the Pirates went flying by the Dodgers. Well, Dodger players were unhappy anyway, and they were really ticked off that the Pirates had a much better bus. So now the players began to grumble. Here's the 1-2 pitch on the way. Inside, 2-2. And one of the Dodger players grumbled, "Why don't we have a bus as good as the Pirates?" And the Dodger traveling secretary, without thinking, said, "If you had played better, you'd have a better bus." Whoa. Now you have an unhappy bus. And Walter Alston immediately said to the driver, "Pull over." So the driver pulled over. Alston stood up, very tall, very strong. And he looked at the entire team. His face usually got white instead of red. And he looked at the team and he said, "I'm getting off the bus now. And if anybody disagrees with things, I'd like him to get off the bus and we'll talk about it." And you knew what he meant. He was challenging the entire club. That's ball 3 to Goldsmith. Well, nobody stirred, and Alston got back on the bus. And he turned to the traveling secretary and said, "Don't you ever make a comment about how the team plays. I will now on conduct what kind of a bus we'll have, and anybody disagrees, I'd love to talk to him." Alston sat down. Silent bus. We went to the airport, flew back to Brooklyn, and the Dodgers began to play super and wound up winning a World Series. And everybody connected with the team that year said, you know what? They would not have played that well until that bus incident going uphill in Pittsburgh. That'll do it for Goldsmith. Thanks for a 6-pitch at bat so he could tell you the story. One away. Our hero of the day was a witness of the devastating Pearl Harbor. That's when Corporal Secchi volunteered for the Army. His unit was the all-Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Pitch swung on and fouled back, 1 away. Anytime I hear Pearl Harbor, I was 14 when we had Pearl Harbor, and there is our distinguished hero indeed. When I think about Pearl Harbor, I almost automatically think that's the only time I ever heard my father swear. At 14, I can see I was crawling under the big family radio, and I was listening to a football game. The New York Giants football team in the NFL. The count goes to 1-2. In that game, I do remember the only time the great Mel Hein was ever injured was on Pearl Harbor Day playing for the Giants. 1-2 pitch on the way. Little nubber up along first. Shoots, picks it up and throws him out. So we have 2 down and the batter will be Utley. Well, anyway, as a kid, and they interrupted the game, and my thought, why would they do that? The Giants were on the move. And in those days, they didn't score much at all. Hardly ever passed the ball. And so when they interrupted the football game and they said Pearl Harbor, my first thought was that's probably in China, because as a little boy the Chinese and the Japanese were fighting, and the word Pearl Harbor made me immediately think of Asia and the Asian. Well, I was wrong, but so I went into the kitchen where my mother and dad were having their usual cup of tea at that time of day. Here's Utley up there, and he takes ball 1. And I said to my dad, who had traveled all over the world in the British Navy, and anyway, and I said, where's Pearl Harbor? And he said, it's in the Hawaiian Islands. Why? And I said, well, the Japanese just bombed it. And then he let out an expletive, which was really shocking because he never swore. And then he just simply said, that's war. And I remember going back, listening to the Giant game, not giving him much of a thought. Wow, what a beginning. Well, we've had a little fun whenever we had a flat spot in the broadcast talking about Babe Ruth. The last thought I have about Babe, I was pretty young. I must have been, I would say, about 13. I was a member of the Police Athletic League and the Catholic Youth Organization in New York, which meant after school every day, there were no lights, I could go to the game free. Not on the weekends, not on Saturday and Sunday, but certainly on the weekday after school. Jay Gobert is going to lead it off, hitting 4th there. Anyway, I was in the Polo Grounds in New York, upper deck and right field. I mean, I can remember that as clear as a bell. And a strike to Gobert. Anyway, there was a commotion. A lot of people were running over to another area not too far from where I was. So, being a kid, I went over to see what all the noise was about. And there he was, the way you would imagine him. 1 ball, 1 strike. There was Babe Ruth. He had a camel coat on, and he had a cap. Not a baseball cap, a cap. And the kids were all around him wanting his autograph. That's going to be a strike, 1 and 2. And I can see and hear him now. Just a minute, just a minute. And he reached into one of the side pockets of that camel hair coat, and he took out what I would say was a stack of business cards. Little cards that people use for business. 2-2 the count. They were blank on one side, and on the other side was a stamped Babe Ruth signature. So there was no pens or pencils or paper. He just handed out the business cards. And you might say, did you get one? You bet I did. Do I still have it? Nope. Lost it. I don't know. Disappeared. Probably wouldn't be worth much because it was a stamped signature, but it was the Babe. And I must say, it was beautifully handwritten before it became a stamp. 2-2. The worst signatures in America, without a doubt, can be found on baseballs signed by big leaguers. The worst. The Miami Marlins were a AAA minor league ball club owned by Bill Veeck. Yeah, the same Bill Veeck. Strike one, pitch on the way is off the plate. One of the things that Bill Veeck did as a promotion, he signed Satchel Paige, who was very close to being 50 years old and still pitched very well in AAA. The 1-1 pitch, Gonzalez doesn't get it on a big swing, 1-2. On that ball club back in 1956 was Whitey Herzog, now a Hall of Fame manager, but Whitey was an outfielder. And they were playing in Rochester, New York, and Herzog was out in the outfield, and he noticed a promotional thing in the Rochester ballpark. The 1-2 pitch fouled away. There was a hole in the fence in center field, and above it was a sign: if you hit the ball in the air through the hole, you get $10,000. So Herzog went back into the clubhouse, got a bunch of balls, went out to center field and tried to throw a ball through the hole, and he couldn't do it. The 1-2 pitch on the way is a ground foul. So then when he went back in before the game started, Whitey was talking to Satchel Paige. He said, "Satch, you see that hole out there in center field?" And Paige said, "Yes, wild child." He said, "I'll bet you a bottle of bourbon that you can't throw the ball through that hole." The 1-2 pitch inside, ball 2. So the next day, before batting practice, Herzog had a bunch of balls, and he took Satchel Paige out. Herzog marched off 60 feet 6 inches from the hole. The next pitch foul back. He gave Satchel Paige the ball, and Satchel said, "Wild child, does the ball fit through the hole?" And Whitey Herzog said, "Satch, it sure does." He said, "Then you have a bet." So he held the ball up and looked over the ball like he was aiming a rifle. 2-2 pitch, and Adrian pulls it foul. Now Paige winds up and throws. The ball goes into the hole, spins around, and pops out again. And Herzog thinks, "Holy mackerel, he'll never come any closer to that." Paige picks up the next ball, aims right through the hole, clean as a whistle. He said, "Wild child, I will take that," and walked off the field. So the Miami Marlins and Bill Veeck and Satchel Paige, my thanks to Adrian Gonzalez for fouling off all those pitches as he strikes out. And we have one down here in the bottom of the 3rd inning. We might tell you a little bit about the origin of the Giant-Dodger rivalry, and not to go too far back, we would start 1933 when the Giants and Bill Terry, the manager, won the World Series. The Brooklyn Dodgers finished 26.5 games back. The pitch to Crawford fouled away. So in spring training in 1934, they were interviewing Bill Terry, and somebody asked him about the Brooklyn Dodger prospects, and Terry said, "Oh, the Dodgers, I haven't heard anything from them. Are they still in the league?" Well, the borough of Churches suddenly became anything but, and they were furious at Terry and the Giants. Well, the Giants played well in 1934, but their lead certainly disappeared late September. They were a beaten up, tired club. They had 2 games left with the Dodgers, and they were tied with the famous Gas House gang of the St. Louis Cardinals, led by Dizzy and Paul Dean. What happened? Well, the Giants lost to the Dodgers on Saturday, and they lost Sunday as that chopper fouled down the line. So the devastated Giants lost 2 straight to the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the Cardinals wound up winning the pennant by 2 games. So that was really the beginning modern time. The remark about are they still in the league, and the Dodgers coming back to wreck the Giant plan. Have you ever heard the Red Sox or Boston being called Beantown? Yeah, sure you have. 0-2 the count to McCarthy. Well, believe it or not,
When you talk about beans and Boston, you really begin the story with molasses. The next pitch in there, and that'll do it for McCarthy. 3 looks, and down he goes for David Price, his first strikeout, and the batter Howie Kendrick. Boston's active partaking in the so-called triangular trade, and their molasses export was huge. And the molasses within the city was a prominent food staple. And what they would do is, when they had their beans, their special beans, they would mix in molasses. And these were then called Boston baked beans, not just baked beans. Hard to find a restaurant serving those famous beans, but there are good recipes, and you always begin with beans and molasses. That's it. That's not going to stop traffic or anything like that, but Rob Menchel looked it up for us because we were wondering about Beantown. On this day in 1939, it was a day that's had an effect on all of us ever since. On that day, Red Barber opened up the first baseball telecast ever in a game against Cincinnati at Ebbets Field. He opened up by saying, "This is Red Barber speaking. Let me say hello to you all." And from that, we've come to this. Let's go back to this one. Marlins leading 3-1. That first game that was televised was between the Dodgers and the Cincinnati Reds. Leave it to the Dodgers. They lost on that first telecast. Of course, years later, the Dodgers opened up Dodger Stadium in 1962 against the Cincinnati Reds with a great deal of fanfare, understandably, and they lost that game too. The game that was televised in Ebbets Field was the first game of a doubleheader, and the Dodgers won the second game 6-1 to get a split. How many cameras do we have doing this game? We have 13 cameras doing this game to watch Reyes get a walk. In 1939, the first telecast of a Dodger game, of any baseball game, they had two cameras. And of course, when you think of all the equipment, and they're going to have a meeting at the mound, so you can think about all the equipment. Remarkable. I remember the only time I ever started to watch the Don Larson perfect game in the World Series. I was fortunate to work it with Mel Allen. I had never, outside of seeing the game actually happen, I'd never seen the tape. And they showed it when Major League Baseball opened up its television network. I was sitting home on a Sunday watching football, and I figured I'd tune in when I thought that I was on, you know, a little egotistical, to see what I was doing back in 1956. I swear I turned it on, I watched one hitter, and went back to football. It was so dull. Do you ever think about what we just talked about, the home plate? You ever wondered where in the world did they come up with the idea of a plate? Well, if you do some research, it's kind of interesting. Before 1900, home plate was a 16-inch square. All the other bases are 15 square inches. It was just another base. They turned it so that one point of the base would be facing the pitcher, but that didn't seem to work. Over the years, believe it or not, they used a lot of things to be called home plate. At one time, back 1869, home plate was actually circular and 12 inches in diameter. And way back then, home plate was made of wood. Some of them were made of cast iron. Some were even made of marble, or, believe it or not, a plate, a real dinner plate. And that's why people call it the home plate. Kind of interesting. 1 ball and 1 strike.
We often talked about Chad Billingsley saying that he pitches with the sword of Damocles over his head. That's an old Greek legend. The ruler was Dionysus, and he had a guy in the courtier in the court who would always talk about how great the ruler had it. And so finally the ruler said, okay, I'll tell you how great we have it. The pitch is high, ball two, and he had a big dinner for Damocles. And there at the head of the table was the chair and the beautiful table set up. And Damocles sat down, and directly above his head was a huge sword, and it was tied by one horsehair. And Damocles got the idea. This will be the 7th pitch to Eric Stultz. Chad ready, checks, right-handed deals, high fly ball to deep center. Kept going back, away back. This one is over the wall. And it's the Padres on the scoreboard, leading 3-0. One quick story involving me. One year, I actually wore a Dodger uniform and sat quietly in the Dodger dugout. They were playing the Chicago Cubs. Zimmer was the Cubs manager, and I had asked for permission to do it. And I didn't think anyone except some of the Dodger players knew I was even in the dugout, because I crept in right after the anthem. And I sat there with the cap pulled down over my brow, arms folded at my chest, and I wasn't going to make a move. And at the end of half an inning, the late John Vukovich, who was the first base coach for the Cubs, as he ran by the dugout, he hollered, "Vinny." And I looked up and he threw a ball to me. And I caught the ball, and on the ball it said, "If a fight breaks out, I want you." And it was signed Zimmer. And I looked over, and the Cubs were just falling down on the bench in laughter. Some secret that Scully was in the dugout. But he was just wonderful. It was an honor, a pleasure, and a huge grace to have known Don Zimmer, believe me.
That was a true story involving Jackie Robinson and the Dodgers. They were playing in Cincinnati, and Jackie had gotten some very serious death threats. So serious, the FBI, the police department were all over Crosley Field, and they had sharpshooters on the rooftop of Crosley Field. There were sharpshooters on the roof of the laundry back of left field. There were also sharpshooters on top of the post office or first base and down the line. So it was serious, and there was a great deal of tension amongst all of those who knew about it. And the Dodgers had their usual pre-game meeting, and it was even more tense as they tried to get a game frame mentally instead of worrying about Jackie Robinson being shot at. And while the meeting was going on, a Dodger left fielder from Brooklyn, good-natured, happy-go-lucky guy named Gene Hermansky, and all of a sudden, right in the middle of the meeting, Hermansky said, "I've got it." And everybody turned and looked at Gene, and they said, "You've got what?" And he said, "I know what we can do to ease the tension on Jackie." And they said, "What is it?" He said, "We'll all wear number 42. Well, it broke the tension in the room, and they went on to play a game, and thank the good Lord, Jackie was not bothered, and the game went on as scheduled. And when they finally decided in baseball where everyone would wear 42, it's only right to remember Gene Hermansky. Who would have thought that indeed that day would come where everybody wears number 42? You know, Bumgarner tells a story which, in a sense, reminds you of what it takes to be a big league ball player. It's 2 years ago in spring training, and he and his wife were roping cattle, which is what they do. 1-1 pitch, sinker low, ball two, 2-1. And they were startled by a large snake, and Madison thought it was a rattlesnake, so he grabbed an axe and he hacked the snake to pieces. But there's something more to the story. 2-1 pitch, low, ball three, 3-1. When his wife Allie and an expert field dresser examined what was left of the snake, she found 2 baby jackrabbits inside pieces of the snake and extracted them. 3-1 pitch to Turner, way inside, ball 4. And after she extracted them, a short while later, the Bumgarners noticed that one of the rabbits had moved slightly. It was alive.
Well, his wife brought the rabbit back to their apartment. For the next few days, they kept it warm, bottle nursed it, and the rabbit soon was healthy enough that they released it into the wild. And Madison said, just think about how tough that rabbit was. First it gets eaten by a snake, then the snake gets chopped to pieces, then it gets picked up by people and lives. It's all true. Meanwhile, line drive base hit to center by Hendrick, and the Dodgers are in business, first and second and nobody out. So I guess really the morale to the whole story about the rabbit and the snake, you've got to somehow survive. You've got to somehow battle back. A lesson well taught for all of us. Remember the other day we were commenting, and it kind of caused a firestorm on the internet, because I had been told by someone, you know, there's a story that redheads will be extinct by the year 2060. So I happened to mention that I had been told that. Fly ball to right field. Brown is there. Anyway, Rob Menchel went on the internet, pulled up a story, and that's been an old story. Going back to 2006, people talking about the fact that redheads would be extinct by 2060. And we're happy to say there is no truth to the story. Just one of those things. Ticket to the Beatles. Way back on this day in 1966. More about that later. And the first pitch to Seguin. 1 ball and no strikes. The Beatles were here on this day 50 years ago. We had 45,000 here. They were not allowed on the field. And the performance started at 9:30. It was over at 10. Beatles performed 11 songs in 27 minutes. 2 balls and no strikes. Foul back. The big thing and the story was what happened when the Beatles finished and were going to lead. They had a Lincoln Continental that was waiting to get them out of the ballpark and on the way to wherever they wanted to go. Ground ball to the right side, going back to smother it is Zobrist, and he can't do it. Ball gets away from him, and Seguin is aboard, and it'll be a base hit. So a leadoff single by Rob Seguin. That'll bring up Yasmani Grandal. So the idea was the car with the Beatles would exit the ballpark and clear out. But the fans, there must have been 10,000 kids waiting beyond the pavilion, and they were frenzied. They pulled off the car's hood ornaments, side mirrors. The car was stuck in a virtual sea of humanity. So they moved the car with the Beatles back out onto the field and went all the way back to the Dodger dugout. The Beatles jumped out and went back to the Dodger clubhouse trying to figure out a plan of escape. That's ball 1 to Grandal. So a new plan was devised. They'd use the armored car to depart as they used to arrive. But someone had let the air out of the tires during the show, and the car couldn't really work. So they decided, okay, how to sneak the Beatles out. And they got an ambulance. Here's the 1-0 pitch. That's a little high, ball 2-0. And the Beatles were put into the ambulance. They were covered with blankets, with lights flashing, sirens blaring. The ambulance seemed a reasonable bet to get through the crush of kids beyond center field. And the plan was once they got through the kids, they would get out to the 76 station. They would get out of the ambulance into the armored car, now with fully inflated tires. That's a strike. 2-1. Again, something went wrong. The driver had navigated through the fans, hit the gas, and the ambulance ran over a speed bump. And would you believe the radiator fell out of the ambulance? I mean, can you imagine the Beatles stranded in Dodger Stadium? Here's the 2-1 pitch to Yasmani Grandal. Fastball, foul back. Well, that got that armored car to rescue them. The kids had figured out what was going on.
and the armored car was surrounded by fans, unable to move in any direction. But suddenly the Beatles caught a break. From out of nowhere, the Hells Angels showed up, encircled the armored car, led the Beatles out of the parking lot and on out into the night. What a story. Here's the 2-2 pitch, and that's low. Next night, the Beatles were in San Francisco at Candlestick Park, and that would be their final live performance before an audience. They became entirely studio-based the next 3 years. The Beatles came to L.A. 50 years ago today.
Did I ever tell you about the time Jackie and I raced each other on ice skates? No, well, I'm not going to tell you now, but that's going to be hit into right field. Ethier on the run, picks it off. One away. So Connor Gillespie and out to right, and Barry Zito coming up. What happened was Rachel and Jackie and I were going up to a resort in the Catskill Mountains a long, long time ago. Being a kid from the East, I had ice skates. Jackie and Rachel said, "Oh, you're going to go skating?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "We'll go with you." Oh, I said, "That's great." Now, the only problem was Rachel was about 7 months pregnant. Sure enough, she got ice skates. Now Jackie is putting his skates on alongside of me in the dressing room, and he said, "When we get out there, I'd like to race you." I said, "Jack, I didn't know you ice skated. You're from Southern California. I knew football and baseball, but I didn't know ice skating." Squirts down to Gordon. 2 out. Anyway, I said, "I didn't know you ice skated." And Jackie said, "I've never been on skates in my life." So I started to laugh. I said, "Hey, Jack, come on, let's face it. I mean, I'm not a great skater, but I can skate." He said, "I know." But I said, "I want to race you because that's how I'm going to learn. And if you've never been on ice skates and you put skates on, the first thing you do is walk on your ankles." And sure enough, he was running on his ankles on the ice trying to beat me. But what was as memorable and scarier was Rachel. She was on the ice with a girl whose name I believe was Maureen Millerick, an Olympic skating star. And there was Rachel, 7, 8 months pregnant, kind of mincing around on her ice skates. I had my heart in my throat. But anyway, there aren't very many people who can say, "Oh, sure." Johnny, to make the understatement of the day, has had a very tough life. We can give you maybe 1 or 2 stories. We don't want to get into too much of the privacy area. Let's start when he was 12. He was doing work on his grandmother's house, and a hired hand showed up with a wolf on a leash. Here's the 2-0 pitch. 2-1. Anyway, Johnny loved dogs. He had never owned one, though he had no idea about how serious a wolf might be. So he walked up to the wolf, and the man hollered at him, "No, it's a real wolf. Don't pet it." The 2-1 pitch in. Yeah, well, the man ties up the wolf, goes around the corner to mend the fence, and Johnny goes back to the wolf, saying something like, "Oh, I'll talk to him and it'll be great." And the wolf attacks him, has knocked him down on his chest, just about ready to devour him. 2-2 pitch, check swing, no swing, ball 3. Johnny suddenly, totally and completely relaxed. He was done. He knew it. And whatever he did by relaxing, the wolf decided, I don't have a rival here. And the wolf got off his chest. Johnny got up and walked away. Ground ball by the diving Turner, and the base hit by Johnny Gomes. So a 1-out single left by the wolf man. And funny, the memory. Every time I say Albert, I think of when I and many others were kids,
many years ago. And not talking about Fat Albert, whom a lot of people certainly remember. It was a dumb thing to do, but kids do dumb things, although it was harmless. We would call a tobacco store and say, do you have Albert in a can? You know, there was Prince Albert, right? And kids would say, do you have Albert in a can? And the guy would say, yes, I do. And we'd say, would you please let him out? And we'd hang up. We've lost a nickel. And we thought it was hysterical. And for some reason, when I say Albert, I'm not thinking of the great Pujols. I'm thinking of being about 11 years old. 2-1 the count. Boy, Albert's long been out of the can. He's got 40 home runs last year. An all-timer on his way to the Hall of Fame.
Bottom of the second inning, no score, and the subject is Mike Matheny. Matheny, 44 years old come the end of September, born in Ohio, lives in Missouri. But he was not even 18 years old, and he came to the University of Michigan with a major league dilemma. Earlier that summer, the Toronto Blue Jays had drafted a catching prospect in the 31st round, but Matheny decided to honor his college commitments, but he had a lot of doubts. Getting drafted was a dream come true, and if he waited till later on, the next time the offer would be less or not forthcoming at all. So he was a young man, not 18, and a lot of pressure. Should I turn pro or go to college? Major League Baseball rules allow players to sign with teams up until the player officially enters college full time. That's the key, full time. Anyway, Matheny showered, ready to go to class for the first day. Walked out of the dormitory, stomach knotted, and a pigeon defecated directly on his head. Now, conventional wisdom would suggest the bird bombing was a sign that he should hit the road. But Matheny had to go back and clean up. The pitch to Uribe, a strike, 0-1 the count. He went back and showered and cleaned up and decided all of a sudden he was at peace. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to go to college. And there was one other thing that happened. The strike one pitch swung on and missed, 0-2. Matheny went to his first class, and when he reached class, he noticed a pretty field hockey player named Kristen, and he would marry her and live happily ever after. And that's the story of Mike Matheny and the bird pool. As Uribe hasn't much of a swing as he returns against a great pitcher and strikes out. Right now it's time for our prime ticket Twitter poll. As a fan, do you like watching games in a so-called pitcher's park where the scores are low, or a hitter's park where the scores are high? Tweet hashtag pitcher's park or hashtag hitter's park. Tune in. We'll look at the results later on. Can I ask you an honest question between you and me? What in the world is hashtag? There are so many things in this world that I don't understand. It would fill the Library of Congress. And I just read an item in the paper today. I know you will be thrilled about this. DirecTV will have a channel called Dog TV. That's right, D-O-G, Dog TV. It is to comfort pets when the owner is not at home. Dog TV. Venable, Denorfia, and Alonzo. How do you sell a sponsor to a pet? 1 and 2. You see what can occupy your mind when you're on the road. Yeah, Petco Park. Do you have a smart pet? Oh boy, that is a new one, and it's no joke. I'm deadly serious. Dog TV. Now, does that mean cats can't watch? Whenever we play a team that has a name like the Pirates, I just wonder about whatever Pirates can pass along to you. You know there's more than one pirate flag. They talk about the Jolly Roger black flag with a white skull and crossbones. Really, they also had a red flag. I didn't know that. But yeah, the Pirates had a red flag, and that meant no prisoners. we're going to wipe you out. Still foul. And actually, the term Jolly Roger was based on the red flag. In French, it was something like Joli Rouge, which turns out to be Jolly Roger. Oh, you're very welcome. I just pass this stuff along absolutely free, no charge. So if nothing else, you now know, besides the black pirate flag, there was a red one, Joli Rouge. That red really stood for the fact no mercy. Just a black flag, they tell me, was a sign of a quarantined ship with disease and death on board. So the pirates using black flags instead of the red to symbolize death, and was modified with the skull and crossbones if they cared to do it. There you go. There's red to fight out becoming red in this hot sun. Pirates also use more than skull and crossbones. Yeah, that's Cincinnati red. Pirate flags would have skeletons, spears just crossed, or swords, cutlass, hourglass. The reason for the hourglass, they were flying to let the enemy know the time was running out. Oh ho. And the other thing, that was an ego trip for the captain. He put his initials on the flag, so you know who was about to kill you. Nice touch. You know another interesting thing about pirates? You know how they wore earrings? They thought they could see better wearing an earring. Not hear better, see better. The captain, the dreaded captain of the pirate ship, when they got into a battle, the first thing he would do, change his clothes, so that if he was arrested, they wouldn't know he was the captain. He was the lowest oar on the show. There you go. There's an earring. Obviously he's seeing better, and what he's looking at is a 7-2 pirate lead. I must be the worst baseball scout in the whole world, and I'll tell you why. It has to do with Koufax. 1 ball and 1 strike. The day that he was going to try out with the Dodgers, kind of a bleak Saturday afternoon. Game was over. I knew some kid was going to try out, and I thought, well, I've got nowhere to go. Single. I'll just hang out in the ballpark and go watch this kid, who was just about my age. So I went down to the clubhouse, walked in, and I saw the fella who was going to try out, and my first thought was, no chance. Ball 3. The reason I said no chance was because he had a suntan. I don't mean the so-called truck driver suntan, where only your forearms are tan because you're wearing a uniform. No. He was completely tan. I thought, well, he spent all the time on the beach not playing baseball. So I waited, and he put on the tryout uniform and went down to the right field corner in Ebbets Field, the bullpen. There were only a couple of people there to watch. 3-2 pitch, fouled away. And he threw pretty hard, not any harder than some of the guys I faced when I was trying to play ball in college. And he bounced some curveballs, and I thought, well, he's just a fella who they're taking a look at and spends his time on the beach. And that'll be that. I'll probably never see him again. Yeah, right. Way to go, Vin.